Hi there, folks. This is Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm here very honoured today to be here with the illustrious swordmaker Peter Johnsson, who most of you probably know very, very well, but I'm going to ask him to introduce a bit about himself in a minute. This is the first inaugural episode of what I intend to call the Sword Sessions, where I'm going to interview, talk with, chat with experts in their field, primarily looking at historical arms and armour, of course. And today I'm extremely grateful to have Peter Johnsson giving us some of his own time to talk about some of the things that he's been working on. So first of all, Peter, why don't you introduce yourself and how would you describe yourself and what you do?
Well, Matt, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you about swords and related ideas. Well, I've been working as a swordsmith full-time since 1999. So I'm past 20 years in the occupation. I think if someone has heard about me, it's because I study historical swords and I make quite a bit of documentation work, going around to museums and drawing and measuring originals. And that's a core part of what I'm doing, but I'm also trying to explore the possibilities of the craft from where I am right now, meaning both making homages of historical swords, but also trying to explore what the sword can be in a more, let's say, timeless perspective. So that is making swords that are not primarily sort of qualified by comparison to historical past forms, but more exploring the sword as a shape in its own, with its own merit, so to say.
So in a way, marrying the old with the new, looking at the old and then creating something new as well.
Possibly, yes. It's one of those paths there which is fairly sort of undefined. You find new questions as you go, and of course, another important part of my professional life has been my almost also no, actually more than 20-year connection to Albion Swords in the States, where I think developed more than 100 designs for them over the years.
Yeah. So I have some Albions up behind me, purposefully put up there. Yeah, I mean, Albion swords are famous, of course, and I think very largely because of your involvement and I think the first company to really bring, I won't say mass produced, but produced to standard models, very historically accurate swords. And originally when they came onto the scene at a time when there wasn't an awful lot of very historically accurate swords available. So I think a lot of people, would have heard of you through Albion as Albion's work as well. Is that something that's ongoing? Are you still working with Albion?
Yes. Oh, yes. We have several new models under development, several new museum line swords that I'm very excited about. And we're also looking at expanding the sort of, what should we call it, the basic line, the core line, which is the next generation line. It was a working title for that line, but it sort of took on, and now the line is called Next Generation Line, which is a kind of a feeble name, but that's what we have, and that's what they're known for. So yes, the Next Generation Line will be expanded on as well with new single-handers and long swords as well.
So aside from that, you also yourself make bespoke replicas, historical replicas, but I think you also, you don't make many of those a year, do you?
No, I don't. I don't make many swords each year. It could be between perhaps 4, perhaps 6 swords in a year. So my output is not very big at all. This is both because I spend quite a lot of time making them, and also actually the pre-making of the sword is quite a bit of an involvement, both with sort of documenting originals, analyzing them, collecting ideas into a sketch and then working on that design for a while. So even before you set your foot in the smithy, you worked on a sword for several weeks. So that means that it's quite a bit more labor intensive and time consuming to make a sword in the way I do in my workshop and in my method. And that translates into a small production.
And my understanding is you make some swords with a customer specifically, and then you make some swords that you make because you want to make.
Yes, I only very rarely work on commission, actually, and less over the years. I found that the best swords are usually those that are made based on recent research and ideas. And it also leads to the most satisfied customers, because the customer knows exactly what kind of sword it is. And I'm contacted by someone who really likes what they see. And there is no uncertain wait time or that kind of frustration involved. It's very difficult for me to plan my work, partly because of my personality, which I regret, but also because there is the aspect of working for Albion with, you need to jump in and solve a problem, or there's an opening for a new possibility in a design, and you need to keep that ball rolling. And then you can never know really when an opportunity to do a research trip opens up, when there is a museum who can accept you. So you need to be able to act on that. And then there are other sort of special projects, like an upcoming exhibition for a museum. Then they need a reconstruction, and they usually don't have a lead time of several years. They need the sword in a couple of months. So you need to put that in a special sort of line of production. So all of that means it's difficult for me to present for a customer a realistic idea of completion time. So I don't want to put customers to that kind of uncertain waiting. It's very frustrating, both for the maker and for the customer.
Sure.
So I find that making swords on available now basis and selling them like that is more satisfying, both for me and for customers.
So I think the first time we met in person was in the early 2000s in Dijon.
Yes,
at the HEMA event, and that was very inspirational, and we were all very, very happy to have you there. And you at the time were very much, and still are, one of the leading lights in looking deeper into the construction of swords in terms of their dynamic properties, even geometric properties as well, which you've written quite a bit about. And I remember you giving a presentation to us, which we were all riveted to, and talking about points of rotation and this kind of stuff. How did you? What drew you to that particular? I suspect you have a background that's quite that you have an affinity for engineering and understanding how things work and this stuff.
Yeah. Well, since we don't really have any surviving manuals in how to make swords, the only way to really learn how to make a sword, or to get an idea what a sword is to study originals. And before turning to sword making as my main activity, I worked as a designer, graphical designer, and illustrator. So the whole thing with having design concepts, a purpose of an object, that is, of course, incorporating its function, but also you can look at function from a wider perspective, as the role of the object, not just in the critical moment of use, but also its place in someone's life and in society. All of those questions have always been interesting to me. And as an education training as a graphical designer, which is basically a modernized version of the medieval scribe, it was quite natural for me to look at objects with the eyes of a typographer, So when you look at an object, you try to understand if there is some underlying ideas of proportions. It's a kind of a system of design, which is a very medieval thing to do. So that has been an undercurrent in my work from the very beginning. And of course, the dynamic properties, its practical function as a weapon is absolutely crucial. It's just the basic thing. You need to be able to master heat treat and forging and grinding. Those are like the bread and butter of sword making. Yeah. But then you need to know what to do with those techniques, as in how you shape the sword and why you shape it as it is. It's quite popular to explain the sword as its shape is derived from its function, and that while that is absolutely partly true, it's very far from the whole truth. And I found that to be always very interesting and inspiring. I must also mention in this context Vincent Le Chevalier, who I worked with quite closely in connection to the exhibition The Sword, Form and Thought at the Deutsches Klingenmuseum. I was Sixt Wetzler and I were the curators of that exhibition. So we worked with the selected swords and the catalog. And I wanted to have with that exhibition a way to graphically convey the dynamic properties, the feel and the handling of the sword. So when you were going through the exhibition, you could actually see what the swords felt like and what they were intended to do. So Vincent Le Chevalier used his genius to develop a series of graphs that we could combine into an image that describes the function of mass and rotational inertia and placing out the pivot points. And so discussions with him has been instrumental for me to formalizing an understanding. Even though as a swordsmith, you may have a more or less intuitive understanding from what swords are, from the making of them and from looking at originals. But I always found it to be very helpful to have like a structure or a formalized system of ideas that you can use to describe things that are quite precise and defined, because otherwise it's very easy it easily becomes just fluffy talk that doesn't really convey much exact knowledge and can actually confuse things as much as they explain, like sharpness or weight and balance. They are when you read descriptions of that, it's a kind of a poetry really, which can inspire, but it's also often quite also confusing.
Yeah, I'm sure you've experienced this as well, but in my own handling of original medieval and Renaissance swords, I'm often surprised by how things don't handle in the way that I expect them to when I've seen them, seen a picture of them. And some swords in the hand are completely surprise you.
Yes.
And can feel lighter or can feel heavier based on how the weight's distributed, or they can feel more choppy or more point orientated, and things like this. And I think it's fascinating. It's very difficult to convey that in numbers, but we do need those numbers in order to have a discussion about them.
Yeah, we need numbers, and we also need, well, for me at least, I think visually, I'm not a numbers person. I forget numbers and they don't really convey that much to me. I want to see relationships with things, and they can be expressed both in numbers, but also visually. So for me, if I can look at a graph of what something is, it, for me, conveys much more information. It's more, I can memorize it and I can form an idea of it much more easily than if I see a list of numbers. But this is a personal thing. For some people, written descriptions or numbers are much more accessible and clear. So I think you need different ways to express what the sword is. And I absolutely agree with you. This experience when you hold a historical sword and an ancient sword, I think it's always this mix of, oh yes, of course, and then what is this? This kind of mix of confirmation and surprise two equal measure quite often.
Mm.
And it's you often see these things that go just against like popular understanding or common sayings of what a sword should be to be a good sword. And it's a very complex situation. Swords are composed of many different aspects, and some of them are quite difficult to express and explain. And I find it the only real way to communicate it is to actually make a sword.
Mm. I was working with some swords in the Royal Armouries recently, and there were a couple of examples in there, but I'll pick on one that was, until I had it in hand, I didn't quite realize how much like a crowbar it would handle. And it was, it's a completely genuine sword, an incredibly thick spine cross-section on it. And I think it would probably make quite a poor cutter, but that's its use is obviously it's a knightly sword of the end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th century, to me clearly intended to be used for half swording and fighting in armor, and it's a specialized tool for a specialized job. But looking at it, it's interesting, these two things that we've just been talking about connect it. Looking at it, it still looks like an elegant, graceful longsword with pleasing proportions. And you look at it and think, oh, that's going to feel dreamy in the hand. And you pick it up and you can think, okay, I can really imagine bashing someone really, really hard with this, or grabbing it and jamming it into their armpit. It's very different looking at it and feeling it. So you've got a marriage there, I think, between they had aesthetic ideals that they were aiming for and something they found pleasing or whatever their criteria were. But at the same time, it still has to do the job. And I think I remember in the early days, you got quite involved, certainly verbally, with the HEMA community, who were starting to study the treatises and how these swords were used. And obviously that has a huge relationship on how they're designed as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, this connects to the work I did with Albion when we developed the series of the Maestro line training swords, and they are just one example for sort of each type. But one sort of core concept in that design is that they should handle like examples of actual swords of the type. So the feather sword, the one with the shield and just like a rod-like blade, it's not intended to mimic the shape of some surviving examples of feathers, since they are quite evolved sporting tools. Absolutely. I do believe, and maybe I'm mistaken, but I believe that some of the early depictions of these kind of swords that you see in the Hausbuch and other 15th century depictions, I have a sense that they were closer to the practical training tools for learning the art of fencing, rather than scoring points in a competition setting, which I think, and you must tell me if I'm wrong here, but as year went on, it became more and more of like a competition held at the city square, and you scored point by making a chalk mark on the head of your opponent, and you can tell that some of these feathers are really perfectly made for that kind of use, while a training sword would be, if you want to study the fighting techniques, should be closer to the balance of an actual sharp sword. And there is a difference between these things, I think.
Very, very much so. I mean, I've got a feather up there, and funnily enough, putting it on that rack, it balances too close to the hilt compared to so a normal sword sits on that rack happily.
Yeah, I see that.
You put the feather on there, and I had to slide it very close to the rack, otherwise the hilt wants to slide off. So certainly a lot of modern recreations of them have a balance point very close to the hand. And we see a similar parallel, just to jump into one of my realms, which is 19th century things, with 19th century practice sabers. Often balanced closer to the hand than a real military saber does. So absolutely, there's a compromise to the training weapon, I think. As for an evolution within feather, or what we could now call feathers. Parrot schwert is probably a more correct term, I think,
Uh-huh.
although I'm not an expert on that. You know, they were used in very specific ways, as you say, and there's a lot of references to striking with the flat.
Yes.
So you know, the fact that we wear fencing masks and strike each other with the edges and the points with abandon, I don't think that's necessarily what most people were using feather for certainly in the 16th century. But yeah, I think it's completely possible, if you look at some of the early depictions of feathers, that they had some differences to the surviving examples we have, which tend to be later. There are two examples in Arundel Castle, actually, which Alfred Hutton had access to, and they are quite heavy and quite stiff, and they're quite unlike, for example, the example in Switzerland. So yeah.
Sorry, what date do you think on those Arundel Castle swords? Do you think they are earlier? Are they like early 16th century or even 15th?
It's difficult to say. So they're different from each other. So they're not a pair. They might have been purchased as a pair, but I don't think they started out as a pair. I suspect that one of them is early 16th century, and the other one is probably late 15th century. Just that's purely, yeah, but that's an estimate. You'd be better qualified to make a judgment on that. But looking at the styles of the hilt fittings and their proportions, that would be my guess. But it's only,
I mean, it's difficult because unless you have decorative features, these training swords are quite different in their look from actual weapons.
Yeah.
And again, it sort of hints at that they are actually like they are sporting tools. They are not considered as weapons. But I don't know. Maybe I'm making too much of it. It's just this feeling I get when I study them, when I hold them and look at them. Like, there's something else here.
Yeah, both of those examples, certainly one of them has maker's marks on, so it's possible it might be able to date them a little bit more precisely from the maker's marks by comparing them with other known swords. But yeah, who knows? There's a sword in the Museum of London, you may know, which has this flared hilt, but it's a sharp sword. It has edges on it.
Yes, you have those too. There is one in the Deutsches Klingen Museum. I think it's might actually be a very early 17th century or a 16th century sword, which has a kind of a laurel leaf end to it, which is sharpened, but it has this hilt, and most of the blade is unsharpened, if I remember correctly. So but it's not a bore sword that you might think. It doesn't have this transfer bar or anything. I get this feeling it's a kind of a dueling sword.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be. I mean, we find references to trying to, make the opponent's scalp bleed and this kind of thing. So
it would do
maybe it's that. Yeah. So coming back to the first reason why I contacted you relatively recently to propose this discussion, it was April the 1st, and a lot of people didn't notice it was April the 1st, and you posted some absolutely fascinating images of a sword. So do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, well, first I was a little bit late. It was a few days into April actually, but I guess it can still sort of be sorted under April Fool's Day. It's so for many years I've been very frustrated with the deluge of fakes that are sold quite shamelessly by many dealers online, and it seems like there is no limit to the dishonesty, or it's just completely infuriating. And you can go online and you can tell people that this may not be what you think it is, and all those comments, they drown in the flood. And people keep posting happily, look at this cool sword that I came across, and it's another fake, and it's another fake, and it's another fake. And it's like in the stream of consciousness among sword enthusiasts, like, oh, look at this cool one. I'm going to have a smith make a copy of this one. And it's another fake. And so if you tell that you are interested in swords because of history, because of traditions, because of you want to learn something, there is this idea that the sword should represent truth and honesty. And I mean, of course, we know that is a dream. It's not true, but there is still something to the interest of the sword that touches on these things that I think is important. And I find it to be like a cancer, like a rot with all of these fakes. We can laugh about it, but I think it's quite serious in our little world, at least.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do something about it, and I thought, okay, I'm going to make a fake, and I'm going to make a copy, a reconstruction of it, and I'm going to present it like the real deal, and or rather, I'm going to show images of it and let people draw their own conclusions. I never actually said it was a medieval sword.
Although coming from you, I have to say, when you post pictures of a sword, everyone just assumes, and
Yes,
that's an interesting side.
And that's the point. You assume things.
Yeah.
You assume things. What I said was it's a Type 17. And it is a Type 17.
Yes.
And it has an interesting pommel because it's a very rare type of pommel.
And I think that was genius as well, because you didn't make it an average example of the type. You made something interesting about it to imply
which is also that aspect that there is usually something slightly unusual is also very common with these fakes. There is often something that piques interest. There is a little bit of inlay. There is an unusual pommel. There is something with it that causes, perhaps there is even a heraldic shield somewhere, you know.
Yeah.
They always have this little extra thing.
And it's a distraction.
No, not always. I shouldn't say that, because some are pretty much run of the mill, but it's one of the favorite tricks of these fake makers, to bring some extra interest to it. So I wanted to make a sword and distress it and patinate it in the ways that I think these guys who make these fakes, some of the techniques they're using. And it turned out to be not very difficult at all. And it also turned out to be a fairly quick process, because you don't have to heat treat the sword. You don't have to bring it to final polish. You don't have to make a completed grip. So many of the labor intensive steps you could just skip, because it's going to be broken and distressed to begin with. And that's actually another clue when you look at swords online. If you keep in mind that the fakes are made to look worn and old, if you know that and you look at things, with a little bit of training, you can pick that up. So I wanted to make this sword, and as a kind of a slightly nasty and friendly jest, like, okay, why did you think this was original? Well, I posted it, so I guess thank you for showing trust in me, but it was misplaced, because this was this was just a way to play with people's expectations.
Yeah.
And my plan was to make quite a story of it. I would post photos of this sword in a setting where it looked even more genuine, perhaps on the floor of a medieval church. I would post a story of a medieval battle in Sweden and of a medieval knight, not making any claims, just telling the story of these things and showing the image of the sword. But it got legs, this story, and it was shared way too much. I just couldn't let the joke go on. So after 3 days, I had to confess that this is all made up. Please don't go this route any further, because it will be soon quite real damage here.
And you posted a nice picture of the tang, didn't you? Because you
yes, I have the thing here beside me. So on the backside of the sword, you have the date of making and my maker's mark quite prominently placed. And there are also secret markings on the sword. So even if someone grinds away that mark and repatinates it, there is possibilities to actually reveal it for what it is.
Wow.
So, that's very important. This sword will never be sold. It's a fake. You can't sell it. So, and I think that's another aspect of it. We need to take a responsibility for what we are doing as swordsmiths and collectors and enthusiasts. We need to. It's something that has to do with history, and what we are doing now is also building on that history. So, if we are not careful and apply critical thinking, we will dilute understanding and twist it and corrupt it rather than expand it and deepen it.
I have to say your fake was far more convincing than most of the fakes we see out there, because of course you have a vast amount more experience and knowledge with medieval swords than most of the fakers do. Not to say there aren't some good fakes, but I would say the majority
No.
that I see coming through auction are,
Yeah.
to me anyway, fairly easily identifiable as fakes.
Yeah.
But
the majority of them are quite badly done, and yet they are sold for lots of money, and people never doubt them. It's really depressing. So of course I wanted to make a fake that was convincing. I wanted to make a sword that really looked like the parts. I tried to replicate things that I've seen in originals to, but I think, this is an industry. So I don't know anyone who does this professionally. I should say that. I have no idea who these people are.
Yeah.
It's a different world from the world of honest sword makers who make honest replicas. It's a very different world. You, as a sword maker, a custom maker, you have contact with customers. You sell your swords through your own name, through your own credibility, building trust with people who know that this guy makes swords that I like, and I trust his working ethics and his procedures. I can trust the quality of the work. It's like a complete mirror image to the world of fake makers, who must be, from the look of them, being like workshop related. You can see groups of them. They share the same style. They repeat the same kind of patination and distressing. You almost like handwriting. You can see the style of a maker or a group of maker being repeated in different swords.
Yeah.
And they, of course, work through the contact of dealers. And that's the main thing. There are dealers, very well established antique dealers, who know the hunger for historical swords. So they need to find swords to sell. So they get newly made swords delivered to them. That's the key. It's not the root of the problem is not those who are capable of making fakes, but there is this absolutely rotten business of selling antiques that are not antiques, but quite newly made things.
So
that's an integrity problem with the antique business that is getting more and more severe. So there will be a point where you can't even sell genuine things, because the doubt will be so big that it will overshadow any kind of proof that you can present. This is, I'm worried that this rot will catch up, and that would be really, really deplorable when that happens, because then we can't really trust our history of art and our history of objects, because everything will start to look like a fake.
Yes, and it's a double-edged sword, to use the saying, in that I think the internet has meant that the collectors are better educated than they ever have been before, and can share information about fakes more quickly and more easily. But that also helps the people making the fakes to refine their fakes. So so it's difficult. And within I deal mostly 18th and 19th century swords, and there are fakes. There are known fakes, but most of those are mass produced, most of them in India, and once you know what they look like, you can spot them from a mile off. Medieval swords, more difficult, because obviously their state of preservation. You can get one that's river found or archaeologically found, and you can hide a multitude of sins. I think for a common person, for a common collector, you can hide things behind the corrosion, essentially.
Yes.
But I mean, I've met people in my 20 years of being involved with the antique industry who fake things, who put fake inscriptions on things, fake dedications, and obviously I won't name names because I don't want to end up in court. But equally, you only have to look at online auctions these days to see that there are some auction houses, particularly in the UK, who are regularly handling obvious medieval fake swords, month in, month out.
It's really saddening and infuriating. And the thing with those newly made medieval and Viking swords is that there is a number of things that you can objectively point at, like these are traces of modern manufacture that even through distressing and patination can be seen. But again, like you, I don't want to pinpoint this. I don't want to explain what that is.
Yeah.
Because that's, if someone who makes fakes listens to this, they will know not to do that.
I have literally
I don't want to give them a free lesson. Like,
yeah,
I want them to keep doing those stupid mistakes, because thank you, you just told me who made this.
I've literally had someone who does that, who's asked me, Matt, how did you know? And I'm like, I'm not going to tell you that. Why would I tell you that? You know?
No. So it's a problem. I'd like to do workshops with people who should know. Perhaps they already do know, but from what I see exhibited in museums, I have a feeling that they don't. You see newly made fakes on proud display in museums sometimes, and it's not a good situation.
And this is big money. And you know, if we take a known famous group of swords, the Castillon swords, supposedly from the River Dordogne. I know there are some people who doubt their origin.
There are stories around that.
Yeah, it's a very complex one, but clearly Ewart Oakeshott sort of believed most of what he'd heard. And I think there was a real group of swords. I mean, there's similarities, there's certainly groupings in there that they're quite a, to me anyway, quite a harmonious group of two main groups of swords with some outliers. But I have seen faked medieval swords, or rather, let's say, I'm not 100% certain, but not part of that group, identified as part of that group because it increases their value. And we're talking about huge values here. I mean, you know, I'm sure you've held quite a number of those, and I've had the honor to hold a couple, and the prices they sell for are in the tens of thousands of dollars. And one of the Alexandria swords sold for, I think, $200,000 in auction. So we're talking big money.
Yeah, those are like favorite subjects of fake makers, of course, and you can see both those with Arabic inscriptions claiming to be part of the Alexandria group, as well as new and happy members of the Castillon group.
Yes,
so I've studied quite a few originals from both of those groups, and also a number of fakes that claim to be members of both of those groups. And it's interesting to see what those who make fakes sort of latch onto, what it is they look for and what they try to reproduce, and typically fail at reproducing each and every time. So I could go on with this. It's just, there's something with this thing that really gets to me in a way that is beyond rational. I should just let it go because it's not healthy. But I guess one way to deal with it for me was to make this joke about it, and to have people perhaps laugh at me a little bit, but also laugh with me. Like, okay, we know I mean, we are all victims of hope and enthusiasm, and we want to believe things. That's just how we are. And it's good to keep track of those impulses, because you can be led astray.
Yeah. So purely before we move on to the next thing, there were two things about your fake that meant that I didn't doubt it's the fact that it was genuine. Number one, it was you, and I think that's a very important. Well, no, so and that's something to bear in mind, I think, because when a very reputable seller or auction house or whatever has something that's not genuine, I think a lot of people don't look as carefully because they just assume that it's it's coming from a trustworthy source. And unfortunately, in the world of medieval swords, you can't, as you say, some museums have them. And the second thing is, you did one particular thing on your fake that I won't say what it is, but one thing on it that most of the fake medieval swords I see don't have, and that meant that I just didn't even question further whether it was genuine or not. So
thank you for that.
But anyway,
then you appreciated that bit of extra effort.
Yeah. So right. So the other thing that you've been heavily involved with is, in the last few years, is looking at sword making as an art form beyond just replicating what we see in a museum, just creating a copy of something, but creating something that's from you. Tell us a bit more about what you've been involved with.
Yes, well, one of the earlier expressions of this was also part of the sword form and thought exhibition, where we wanted to also show that there is art and craft of the sword today. There is actually, it's a small but vital activity of sword makers. So we wanted to have examples of contemporarily made swords as part of the exhibition. And of course, selfishly, I wanted to be part of that group, but we also invited 3 other makers, or in one case, a pair of makers, to make a sword on a theme, and do their own interpretation of what the theme meant and what kind of sword would be the result of that. So the theme was the Xephos, which is the only real rule was that you weren't supposed to make a replica of a Xephos, which is the classic, the double-edged sword of the classical Greek period. You may appreciate the word Xephos as consisting of xi and phos. Xi meaning going through or penetrating, and phos being light. And I don't know if it's the true interpretation of it, but see it as a play of word, that a sword can be seen as penetrating light. And that was then a nice theme for what to do with a sword that is penetrating light. So that was fun. It was very engaging, and was great to see other makers joining in on the same theme, to see the result of that. We had Jake Powning and Peter Florianek and Ralph and Sabine Hoffman making their own suggestions of what that meant. Previously, before that, I made swords on the theme of the Vorpal sword, which is the sword from the poem Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll, which is also again a kind of a timeless interpretation of the sword. It's a nonsense poem, but it expresses a very timeless idea of the hero who goes into the unknown, into chaos, to defeat a monster. And that's been part of the story of the sword from, I think, from the very, very beginning of swords existing. It's about defeating the monster, and whether it's an unhumanized human opponent, or if it's a destructive part of yourself that you weed out through training and self-reflection, or what it is, it's a vital part of what the sword is. So again, the penetrating light in that context is interesting. So all of these ideas has been active for me for a long time. It was also part of the Arctic Fire project that we did with Dave Stevens over the years before, makers meeting and talking about aspects of the craft. So the fact that the sword has always had a role as a narrative object, we sometimes sort of humph at the idea that the sword should be seen as an object of art history, that we sort of lose some of the essential quality of the sword when we look at it as a piece of art. And I can understand that aspect, because it sort of takes away a lot of the vitality and interest of the sword if you only depict the prettiness of the hilt. But this is not about the prettiness of things or prettifying things. It's rather than trying to look at the sword as something more than just a cutting or thrusting implement.
Yeah.
The sword is worn by people, and by that they tell themselves something about themselves. Their aspirations and their hopes and fears are reflected in them carrying the sword. But it also tells the world around them of who they are, if they are in the service of someone, if they are like a self-propelled gentleman, if they are a military person. It defines them in society. So a sword is in that way a mirror. You see yourself, who you are, and the society is also mirrored in the sword. Society will get an idea of what is the role of violence. How do we socialize violence in this society? Do you leave the sword at the city gates, or is it something you wear in town? Do you wear a sword to reinforce your right to vote? Do you do it in the service of your country? Is this something that is essential to defend your faith? And all of these ideas are problematic. It's not about building an ideal here. It's about looking at what the sword is as an object that defines us and society through history. And the sword is very crucial in that. It's very important. It's been part of every society, I think, that has developed a metallurgy. Mm. So there is a closeness between the sword and the person, the sword and the human. Every sort of good quality in a sword, sharpness, balance, flexibility, toughness, they are also descriptions of a qualified person. You are flexible, you are sharp, you are tough, you are balanced. So in that way, the sword is very anthropomorphic. Mm. And we know this letter to the king of what's the tribe? I forget names, but you know this this diplomatic gifts of swords, and the letter back with thanks, saying that the steel in their blades is much more valuable than the gold in their hilts, and they describe the pattern welding, and it's a famous quote that I now completely mislaid. But there is one line there that is really important, I think, and it says that their shiny surface reflect truthfully the face of whomever looks at them. So the sword is really a mirror. Yeah. And I think that has a metaphysical aspect as well. It tells something about what the sword is to us and how we are transformed by the sword. You can see when you put a weapon in someone's hand, they show something of their true self. And we can see that through history with horrifying examples.
Yes, I've been asked many times over the years why I think the sword has such a special place in society, not just Northern European society, not just European. You know, it could be whether you go to Japan or China or anywhere that had swords. Basically, why do swords have this special place as opposed to the spear or the axe or the bow? And bows are highly revered in some places, and that's more to do with usually the discipline of archery rather than the object itself. But yeah, it's very, very difficult to, I think, provide a concise answer to that question.
You can't do that, and obviously I grow verbose whenever I try to explain this. But it's for me, part of being a swordsmith is an important part, and perhaps for me one of the most important parts is to explore this. What is it that I'm making when I'm making a sword? Why am I making a sword? Why do I dedicate decades of my life to making these kind of objects? It's difficult to explain, but I keep returning to it. And I think one of the things that I find exciting and interesting is that it's an object that is both a very dire warning and also an object of inspiration and aspiration. It tells us to be responsible and to try to be the best we can be. And we also know very well what the sword can turn us into, like the very, very worst of who we are.
Mm.
And I think that is, to me, very interesting. And so I want to make swords that are also objects of contemplations. I want to make swords that are objects of power today, not just because of their connection to history and tradition and ideas. As soon as it is a sword, a real sword, whatever that is, it will automatically connect to history and tradition. We cannot but think about all of that when we see a sword. But then, as soon as you make a sword as a very clear representation of a Viking sword or a knightly sword or any other historical period, you also create a distance to it, because you're not a knight, you're not a Viking, you don't live in the 16th century Spain. So what happens if you make a sword that doesn't have that kind of filter of history between yourself and the sword? It's a sword in its own right, here and now. It's not about making a modern sword, but rather to embrace the idea that the sword is timeless, that it goes through all time, and to make a sword that is as present now as it is in some kind of mythical past.
Yeah.
And to make that object a mirror to yourself. Who are you? Who owns this sword? Who picks up this sword? What image of yourself do you see when you hold this sword? And to me, that is a very, very interesting idea that I would like to explore. Yeah. So that was the idea behind the exhibition, Reflection, dedication to the goddess. So I wanted to make swords that were dedicated to the anima, if you like, and also connecting to a kind of a timeless culture, which is the Greek mythology, which is sort of ingrained in all of Western culture. Mm. So, the reason I could do that was that I was invited to do a solo exhibit by the gallery owner, Brett Holster, who runs Holster Fine Arts in New York. So it was a project of 3 years to make 8 swords and 3 daggers that were then exhibited. The opening was 3 weeks before New York closed down because of the World Plague. So that was a case of timing.
Both lucky and unlucky at the same time.
Yeah. But it was, sometimes you are in these moments in life which are like a doorway. You pass into a different place once you've done a thing. So this project was definitely like that for me. It could have been, I felt like I'm risking some kind of professional suicide now, because I'm making something that is absolutely not historical in the popular understanding of the sword is. I'm exploring the sword as a symbol as much as it is as a functional object. Yeah. And I know that this will be against the grain to many enthusiasts who may previously appreciate what I'm doing. They may think that this is almost like a betrayal in a way. I could see how you could see it like that. But for me, it felt like it was necessary to do that to completely express what I thought was important with the sword. It's part of making even a faithful replica. That aspect of the sword being a mirror and all of that is as crucial when making a study of a medieval sword or a Viking period sword or whatever. But it doesn't really come to the forefront. You can still look at it as an example of a historical object. And all those other ideas are sort of, they really fade into the background. And I think it's a kind of a missed opportunity. I think it's worthwhile to reflect on those things.
So moving now to look at the future, has taking part in this exhibition and going through that lengthy process, I mean, 3 years is a long time in your working life. And has that changed how you see the future of your sword making or any other creation in your career?
I guess time will tell, but I know my head is full of ideas that are sort of seeded by this exhibition project, and they don't really involve a lot of study of historical, or like what I mean study of historical, I mean making replicas. Of course, I will return to that. I think I can't really see why not, but at the moment, what really interests me is to explore the sword as an object in its own right. And it returns to this idea when you show a sword to people who may not really be into this little subculture of ours. A common question is this strange one: is this a real sword? And I guess yes, it is, but it really depends on what you mean with a real sword. For someone who collects antiques, a real sword is, of course, a sword with many centuries of history attached to it, unless it happens to be a newly made fake, of course. So the shadow of the sword is always the fake, or the letdown, or the bad heat treatment, or the whatever, that thing that is hiding, that is not really showing, which of course we want to avoid. So what is that real sword? And I'd like to explore further, like, ideas of those positive things that the sword is associated with, that has to do with self-knowledge and reflection, and perhaps a stoic way of life. I don't know. Anyone can make a list of things that are positive aspirations that has to do with the sword. Many of them are really worth exploring. And we also have a long list of things that we abhor and find monstrous and horrible, that also connected to the sword.
Sure.
So it's interesting to explore those things. How can you make a sword that is both a warning and an object of reflection at the same time?
Is there anything in the world of sword making that you haven't yet tackled that you would like to? Any particular type of sword, or particular artistic treatment of the steel?
How long time do we have?
Oh, so there's loads and loads, yeah.
There's so many artistic techniques and styles. There's so many materials. There's so many sword types. There's so many sword cultures that a lifetime is not enough to study even just a few of them. So that's one of the gifts of this craft, that you will never reach any kind of end point. There will always be way too much left to explore. I want to learn more about decorative techniques and surface treatments, and but also basic things like different ways to shape the blade, and forging blades and hilts. There's, like, in everything you can go deeper. And that's just the gift of this.
Yes. Oh, and I also wanted to touch on the fact that you're not only a sword maker, but you're also a writer. You've written some very fascinating, in various publications, some very, very good articles. Are you intending to write more?
Well, thank you for that. Writing I find to be excruciatingly difficult. It's I think I'm slightly dyslexic. So it's a letter salad sometimes, and writer's block is a constant companion. So writing is really, really difficult. On the other hand, I love the written word, and my background is graphical design and illustration. So of course, books are to me things that are possibly even more fascinating than swords. So yes, I would love to do some kind of writing. I would love to publish. I would love to, if it's in the form of online articles, yes, that's close at hand, but it would be fantastic to be able to put together some kind of published material and work through documentation material I have. There is some, I don't know, 200 plus swords that I've documented that I should really work through and make a presentation of. It would be interesting to make a book for fellow sword makers of, you know, presentation of techniques and materials and ideas, and there is a whole big chapter that has to do with sword design that involves, of course, the dynamic aspects, how you adjust things to fine-tune or dedicate a sword for a certain purpose. But there is also this whole thing with the aesthetics of the sword, how you approach that and how you can relate to it as a maker, how you can think about proportions. And we have this whole wonderful thing with geometry and modular design techniques that is another big chapter. So all of that to make some kind of, make it accessible, that should somehow be published, of course.
Yeah. I mean, obviously I would like that, but at the same time, as someone working on a couple of publications, I know what a nightmare it is to actually get all of your research and ideas down into a book and actually get it published. It takes years, and it's
yes, it does.
It's easier to not do it than to do it, unfortunately, but
very true.
Anyway, thank you very, very much, Peter. It's been fantastic having you on. Maybe we can have another chat in the future about some other specific topic, or if viewers of this video are screaming at your screens because I haven't asked the one question or set of questions that you wanted me to ask Peter, then post below, because maybe that's something we could look at in the future. But I'm hugely grateful to you for coming on and using your time for this. I'm sure the viewers are going to absolutely love this, and it's been a fascinating conversation. It's been great to catch up as well, because it's been a few years.
Yeah, it was really great to talk. Thank you, Matt, for inviting me. I love doing this, and I would love to do it again if another topic comes up. I always love to talk about swords. So
that would be wonderful as well. And maybe at some point in the future, a round table, we could get a couple of our mutual friends on at the same time, and we could.
Oh yes, really, yes, let's do that. That sounds like fun.
Great stuff. Okay, so thank you everyone for watching. Obviously like and subscribe, but share the video around, because I'd love people to see as much of Peter as possible. But thank you once again to Peter, and I hope I'll chat to you again soon.
Thank you, Matt.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.